Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the second lecture pod for week 7 of When Worlds Collide in spring 2020. In the first pod for this week, I talked about the background to the life of Ram Mohan Roy and discussed his experiences when he first visited England in the 1820s and 30s. In the second pod, I want to talk more about Ram Mohan Roy the Indian and the effect that he had on India and on Indians as a mediator between the Indians and the British. So first, some thoughts about religion in India in 1830 when Ram Mohan Roy is becoming a significant figure. The first thing to say is that the great majority of Indians at that time were Hindus, which is to say that they belonged to the family of religions described as Hindu. Now this is a little bit confusing to us today since we think of Hinduism as a religion in the same way that we think of Christianity as a religion or Islam as a religion or perhaps Judaism as a religion. But really there was no single set of doctrines of Hinduism in the early decades of the 19th century. As I say, it was a kind of family of religions with a long and complicated history. Different Hindus in different parts of India understood Hinduism quite differently. In the early 1800s, there were currents within Indian Hinduism, partly driven by the connections with the British and partly driven out of local Indian considerations, who wanted to revive Hinduism in different ways. Some of these folks were referred to at the time and later as the Bengal Renaissance, on the model of the European Italian Renaissance of the 16th century. Many of these folks were members of wealthy Brahmin families, which was the highest caste in the caste structure of Hindu India. And they were looking for a purer Hinduism, which they hoped could remove the corruptions of the Hinduism of the past. In their minds, they were restoring something that had been there in the past and was now lost, and they hoped that in restoring that, they might also restore some of the ancestral glory of India that they believed was in decay. Two institutions were an important part of this: the Hindu College, founded in 1816, and the Brahmo Samaj, founded by Ram Mohan Roy himself in 1828. You can see the first building for that on the right hand side of the screen there. Both of these were efforts to recover an original Hinduism which they believed to have been lost or corrupted over the centuries. Now I have to say, historians of religion doubt that there ever was such an original Hinduism, at least of the kind that these folks wanted to believe in. Rather, it seems this was the kind of myth of origins, if you like, that many religions have. In the period of the Protestant Reformations in the 16th century, Martin Luther and his followers urged Christians to go back to the early church and rediscover the purity of the era of the church fathers and to sweep away the corruptions of all the succeeding centuries. Hinduism was not the same as Christianity, obviously, but a similar instinct arose in the 19th century, that the decline of India as a country and as a culture could be connected to the decline of Hinduism, and there had been some heroic period of Hinduism in the past, which it was important to recover. However, fourth dot point here, and this is kind of complicated, but I think it's important to understand. This effort to return to some golden age in the past, some early primal original Hinduism, which was purer and cleaner and nicer than Hinduism of the present, actually had the effect of doing something quite different. It created, in effect, a modern Hinduism that really looked quite different probably from what early Hinduism did, but which was an effort to reform the Hinduism of Ram Mohan Roy and create something new. Possibly in a similar way, European historians of the European Reformations of the 16th century point out that Luther himself was a very old-fashioned guy. He was a medieval monk who looked backwards to the centuries of the early church. But Lutheranism and Protestantism that came out of Luther's teachings and preachings and struggles was in the end a very modern movement that modernised Christianity. So there were certain curious parallels between what Ramamohan Roy and his friends were doing in India and what had happened in European Christianity over the preceding centuries. Lastly, though I have to confess I know less about this myself, there were similar modernising trends in the same period amongst Muslim intellectuals who were attempting to revive and reform Islam, seeing it also as having been corrupted. And of course, if you know anything about Islam, you'll know that is a long-standing theme in Islam. The Shia tradition in Islam insists that Islam took a wrong turning quite early on, and it's quite common amongst Muslim intellectuals to insist that the primal purity of Islam has been corrupted over the centuries and it's important to return. So all these three religions had a similar urge to return to the past in order to create something that, with the benefit of hindsight, looks actually quite modern and quite new. So some thoughts about Ramamohan Roy himself. There he is on the right-hand side of the screen as a young man. He was born in 1774, when the company rule in India is young. He was born to a wealthy family in Bengal who belonged to the Brahmin caste in Hinduism, which is to say the highest caste. The caste system in Hinduism took you to belong to, if you like, a class, but to carry that class inheritance down with you as if it was your blood through the centuries, so that certain families and types of people were completely separate and distinct from other people, almost as if they were different species of humanity. We talk about the caste system in India as if it's a peculiar, antiquated idea, but if you were Ramamohan Roy and you went to England in the 19th century, it might not have seemed so peculiar and unique, since of course the class system in England at that time often assumed that by virtue of something sometimes called blood, families could remain in quite distinct worlds for centuries, or even potentially millennia, on the basis of a system that was not called caste, but could look to someone like Ramamohan Roy as if it was a sort of caste. Nevertheless, Ramamohan Roy, like many people who followed him in the Bengali elite in the 19th and early 20th centuries, didn't follow the traditions of his family and his ancestors, but rather became a religious and political free thinker. He attempted to open his mind to all that the world had to offer, and in addition to the Hindu spiritual texts like the Vedanta, he studied both the Quran and the Bible so that he could get in his own understanding a sense of all of the world's great religions. Though his family was wealthy, and he as a young man had added to the wealth of his family by engaging in various lucrative property speculations at the expense of some of the British officials in India, nevertheless, he took a job working for the British as a civil servant for the company at Fort William in Calcutta. And like so many others, he expanded his fortune this way in the service of the British in India, even though he was a more aristocratic Indian than most of the British in India were back in Britain. So he had that pervasive experience that so many elite Indians had of having to at least feign some sort of inferiority to people he probably inwardly thought were actually inferior to him. In the course of his studies, and in the course of his encounters with the British at Fort William and also with William Carey, he has an important change of heart and change of mind about the British. When he first encounters the British in India, he has a quite negative feeling about them, as many educated Indians did. He thought they were arrogant and high-handed. They patronised the Indians and failed to take them seriously. They treated them as if they were funny people, not really quite grown-up. He retained part of this prejudice, if you like, against the British, but he also came to see the British in a sort of world historical sense, as the German philosopher Hegel might have said, as a force for progress in India. Ramamohan Roy developed the idea that the ideas of the British, modern European ideas, and their technological and scientific know-how was something to be not rejected but harnessed. It was an important means of reviving a great Indian culture that had fallen into decay and dragging India into the modern world. And in this understanding, his friendship with William Carey was decisive. he was able to engage in a dialogue with Carey on equal terms without being patronised by him, and they could speak, as it were, the same language using the common medium of religion. Historians sometimes wonder to themselves, was Rammohun Roy really a Hindu at all? Was he really some weird kind of Christian or Unitarian, or was he somewhere in between? It's not easy to tell. Rammohun Roy's idea of Hinduism was very unorthodox. He insisted, almost certainly wrongly, that in its origins, Hinduism had been a kind of monotheism, a religion of one God, in the same manner that Christianity, after a manner of speaking, and Islam are, and that its teachings had basically been ethical. It was attempting to teach people to become better people in order that the Hindu God would think well of them. But he insisted that over the passage of the centuries, with the decline of European civilization in its contacts with the rest of the world, Hinduism had fragmented into a series of cults that had created unpleasant and antiquated cultic ideas about caste lines and the worship of idols. He insisted all of these were accretions or additions to an original pure Hinduism that had none of these things. And in fact, if you listen to Rammohun Roy, you could have imagined that the original Hinduism was very much like Christianity or Islam. So those two religions provide for him models for a modern monotheism, out of which he could create, so he believed, something that would resemble the original Hinduism of the past. So he imagines a Hinduism that conceives of one single, universal and egalitarian God, who was the source of everything that was good in the world. This was not a Hinduism that many Hindus of Roy's time could recognise. Like many non-Christians, and indeed a few Christians come to that, Roy was always bewildered by aspects of Christian theology, especially by the concept of the Trinity. As I've said already, the idea that God has three persons, the Father, the Son, who is Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. He thought of this as making Christianity a kind of polytheism with multiple gods, and he imagined that these aspects of Christianity were also leftovers from ancient religions, and therefore that Christianity and Hinduism both needed to be purified of these strange additions that had happened over the centuries, and a dialogue could be had between Indians and Christians to that end. So in Roy's hands, as in the hands of liberal Christians in Europe in the 19th century, it was important to reinvent Jesus in Christian theology, to treat him not as one of the personalities of God, but rather as a wise man, a sort of Confucius or Buddha figure, as I said before. Not God, but a source of the ethical precepts that could teach Christians, and indeed others, how to live a good and noble life. So Roy produces in the end a sort of Hindu-Christian synthesis, transforming both religions into something which many of the adherents of each would not have recognised, and putting them together as a kind of composite modern and scientific faith, much in the manner that the Unitarians did in Britain. This curious synthesis, which was later very influential and has influenced modern conceptions of Hinduism in India, or at least some of them, not all of them, produced, if you like, a kind of liberal Hinduism. Rammohun Roy wove together Hindu religious precepts with liberal political precepts. He emphasized the rights of lower caste Indians and insisted that Hinduism did not really discriminate against them, or shouldn't do at least. He stressed the rights of women and the primal equality of humans, whether male or female. And he stressed universal values of humanitarianism, an idea that he'd borrowed from his European Christian friends. So in Britain, as I said already, Rammohun Roy mixes amongst dissenting Protestants of a rationalistic kind, such as the Unitarians, and he drew upon aspects of their lifestyle, their simplicity of lifestyle, and in particular their vegetarianism, which appealed to him because vegetarianism had echoes in Brahmin Hindu culture as well. while he was in Britain, Rammohun Roy became a kind of celebrity, almost a pop star figure. Lindsay Tupel, in his account of Roy's visits to Britain, writes of the famous 19th century British historian Thomas Macaulay waiting all night for Roy to appear at a venue, kind of like a fan waiting anxiously for the pop star to turn up at the gig. However, amongst, and there's a typo there again, I'm sorry for that, amongst Orthodox Hindus, Rammohun Roy was shunned in his own lifetime as an unbeliever. They believed he wasn't really a Hindu at all. Likewise, he got enmeshed in various complicated controversies with Orthodox Christians in Britain, whom he insisted upon telling that they didn't understand their own religion, which just infuriated them even more. And so a strange paradox emerges in relation to Rammohun Roy, that in the last years of his life, and particularly at the time of his death in the year 1833, he was a more famous and better regarded figure in Britain, as it were his adopted country, than he was in his own country. But at the same time, he became a model in Britain of, if you like, what we would today call interfaith dialogue. One other thing worth mentioning about Rammohun Roy's life and teachings, which is important, relates to the practice called sati, or sometimes otherwise pronounced and spelt sati by the British. The Hindi word meant purification, but it was applied to a Hindu pseudo-religious practice, which encourages, as I said before, the wives of husbands who died recently, their widows, to leap onto the husband's funeral pyre and so die with their husband, as if that was their duty. Under Mughal rule, the authorities had banned this practice, but only had limited success, and they didn't always enforce the ban. As the East India Company spread its rule across India, it kept figures about sati, as it did about almost everything else, and recorded that over the course of 15 years, some 8,000 widows had been encouraged to throw themselves, self-immolate on their husband's funeral pyres. From the middle of the 18th century, this practice had become notorious in England, and English people were horrified by it. They thought it was gruesome, and I imagine that's the way it strikes us as well. Instinctively, probably strike most people that way. At the same time, there was this curious fascination with it, because the wives had obviously shown a wonderfully wifely devotion to their husbands by being willing to throw themselves on their funeral pyre. Nevertheless, liberal reformers, both British and Indian, were outraged by the revival of sati under the rule of the East India Company and tried to stamp it out. And Rammohun Roy and William Carey, having witnessed an occurrence of sati, joined forces to create a kind of joint Indian-British campaign against sati. And so in 1829, Governor Bentinck, one of the governors from the East India Company, formally banned sati and actually enforced the ban, which led to a backlash in India and doubts in Britain as to whether it had been a wise thing to do. When Rammohun Roy travels to Britain, it's primarily to persuade the British that they should continue the ban on sati. So a very complicated relationship there between Rammohun Roy the Indian and the British, where he's trying to encourage the British to stamp out what he thinks are inhumane aspects of Indian culture, even travelling to Britain itself to make the case. Some final thoughts about Roy, and there's Rammohun Roy on the right-hand side of the screen there in his older years, looking very grand and wearing an absolutely spiffy, fancy outfit there. So as I suggested already, Rammohun Roy has an important legacy. In Britain, he became understood in his lifetime and after his death as a key mediator between British intellectuals, a British literary class, if you like, and the Bengali elite. They could find a kind of common cause in universal liberal principles and in the quest for a single monotheistic idea of God, which could transcend all the particular religions of the world. Paradoxically, at the time of his death, his death was not lamented by most Indians. Indeed, many educated Indians said good riddance to him, believing him to have been far too westernized and too westernizing an influence on Indian culture. And here you have, I think, for the first time in the unit, the emergence of a very complicated phenomenon, which is a division within the colonised people themselves, between those who want to cling on to a, if you like, romanticised vision of their own past, and those like Rammohun Roy who want to draw upon and even exploit the modernising characteristics of colonial rule. After his death, and in fact several decades after his death, Rammohun Roy's reputation in India starts to rise again, and he becomes, in the last decades of the 19th century, adopted by Indian literary figures and the Indian literary elite as their father figure. And the nationalist political leaders of the early 20th century see him as the first great Indian cultural figure who led negotiations with the British about British rule in India. And finally, it's worth remembering the text from which we have an extract somewhere up on Views, the text translated into English as How the British Took Control of India. He tells a story of the British arriving in India where they played a progressive role, supplanting the role that the Mughals had played and providing Indians with a chance to recover their lost historical glories. But at the end of the essay, Rammohun Roy's moral is quite stark. The British play a progressive force in India in the present, but like the Mughals in the past, their time will pass, and a time will come again when Indians are in a position and have the capacity to rise up and rule over themselves.